There it is.
Excuse me, sir.
There's a mistake somewhere. Something isn't adding up.
Everyone copied this equation without questioning it. The lecture hall was full that morning. Not a single empty seat. The kind of class where students arrive early just to secure a spot near the front, notebooks already open, pens ready, minds prepared to absorb whatever wisdom would be dispensed from the podium. The chalkboard stretched across the entire front wall, covered in formulas and derivations from the previous hour of instruction. Dust particles floated in the streams of light coming through the tall windows. The room smelled of old wood, coffee, and the particular kind of focused energy that only exists in academic spaces where people genuinely want to learn. And there, near the center of that massive board, was an equation. Nothing remarkable about it at first glance. Just another step in a longer proof, another building block in the tower of logic being constructed before our eyes. Every student in that room copied it down without hesitation. Pencils scratched against paper in quiet unison. The sound of collective agreement, collective acceptance. No one paused. No one frowned. No one tilted their head in confusion or doubt. Because why would they? The equation looked correct. It followed naturally from what came before. It was written with the confident strokes of someone who had taught this material for decades. It appeared in a lecture given by a respected authority in the field, in a prestigious institution where mistakes simply weren't supposed to happen. It looked correct. It felt correct. The professor continued writing, his back to the students, chalk moving with practiced precision. He had given this lecture dozens of times before. Maybe hundreds. The material was second nature to him, flowing from memory through his arm and onto the board like water finding its natural path downhill. Students leaned forward in their seats, some squinting to read the smaller notations, others nodding along as if they were following a familiar melody. There's a certain comfort in watching an expert work. A reassurance that comes from witnessing competence in action. You relax into it. You trust it. You stop questioning because questioning feels unnecessary, almost rude. The room was filled with intelligent people. Future engineers. Future scientists. Future professors themselves, perhaps. These weren't passive learners or disengaged minds. They were actively processing, actively recording, actively building their understanding on the foundation being laid before them. And yet, not one of them caught it. Not one of them noticed the subtle error embedded in that equation. The small assumption that didn't quite hold, the step that looked logical but contained a flaw that would cascade through everything that followed. This is how mistakes survive. Not through stupidity. Not through carelessness. But through the collective assumption that someone else has already verified what we're being told. Through the natural human tendency to trust confidence, to defer to authority, to believe that if something were wrong, surely someone would have noticed by now. But one student noticed something no one else did. In the third row near the aisle sat a student who wasn't copying. Not yet. While everyone else transcribed the equation automatically, this student had paused. Their pencil hovered above the paper, motionless. Their eyes moved slowly across the board, not reading passively but actively checking, actively verifying each step against what they understood to be true. It wasn't suspicion. It wasn't arrogance. It was simply a habit, a deeply ingrained practice of not accepting things at face value, of running the logic through their own internal filters before committing it to memory. Most people don't do this. Most people can't afford to do this, not with the speed at which information comes at us. We would never get through a single lecture, a single meeting, a single day if we questioned every statement, every claim, every piece of data presented to us. But this student had learned, somewhere along the way, that the moments everyone rushes past are often the moments that matter most. Their brow furrowed. Something wasn't adding up. A small inconsistency, almost invisible but present nonetheless. The kind of thing you feel before you can fully articulate it. That slight cognitive friction that tells you to slow down, to look closer, to trust your instincts even when they conflict with what everyone around you seems to accept. The student glanced around the room. Surely someone else had noticed. Surely one of the other brilliant minds in this hall had caught the same discrepancy. But everyone was still writing, still nodding, still following along without hesitation. A hand began to rise. Slowly. Tentatively. Not with the bold confidence of someone certain they were right, but with the quiet courage of someone who had learned that speaking up, even when uncertain, was sometimes necessary. And that small mistake changed the entire room. The professor's chalk stopped moving. He turned, eyebrows raised, looking toward the source of the interruption. 100 heads swiveled in unison, following his gaze to the student with the raised hand. There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when something unexpected happens. Not uncomfortable exactly, but charged, anticipatory. The silence of a system suddenly becoming aware of itself, of collective attention focusing on a single point. Yes, the professor asked, his tone neutral but curious. The student cleared their throat, spoke carefully, pointed to the equation in question and asked a simple question about one of the underlying assumptions. Not accusatory, not confrontational, just genuinely curious, genuinely uncertain, genuinely seeking clarification. For a moment nothing happened. The professor looked at the board, looked at the student, looked at the board again, and then his expression changed. It was subtle at first, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a small tilt of the head. The look of someone encountering something unexpected, something that required actual thought rather than routine response. He turned fully toward the board now, chalk still in hand, and began to trace through the steps he had just written. His movements slowed. His confidence wavered, just slightly, just enough for the attentive observer to notice. The room remained silent. Students who had been copying moments before now looked up, sensing that something significant was unfolding. The energy shifted from passive reception to active observation, from routine to revelation. Then, quietly, almost to himself, the professor spoke. "You're right." 2 words. Soft-spoken. But in that moment they carried more weight than everything else that had been said that morning. He turned to face the class, chalk still suspended in the air, and nodded slowly. "There's an error here. A small one, but it matters. If we had continued with this assumption, everything that followed would have been built on a flawed foundation." He looked at the student who had spoken up. Not with embarrassment or defensiveness, but with something closer to appreciation. Perhaps even respect. "Thank you for catching that." The chalk resumed its movement, corrections flowing across the board, the proof restructuring itself around this new understanding. The class began writing again, but differently now. More carefully. More attentively. The automatic acceptance had been replaced by something more valuable. A renewed awareness that even the most confident voices can be wrong. And even the quietest question can reveal what everyone else missed. That moment lasted perhaps 30 seconds in real time. But its implications would extend far beyond that classroom, far beyond that single lecture, far beyond that particular equation. Because it demonstrated something profound about the nature of knowledge, authority, and the courage required to question what everyone else accepts without thought. Most mistakes don't survive because they're defended. They survive because no one challenges them in the first place. They hide in plain sight, protected by the collective assumption that if something were wrong, someone would have already noticed. But someone is never abstract. Someone is always a specific person making a specific choice at a specific moment. And that choice, to pause, to look closer, to raise a hand and speak up, is what separates those who simply absorb information from those who actually understand it. That moment stays with me because it captures something I learned early. Not in a dramatic flash of insight, but gradually, through observation and experience. The kind of learning that seeps into your bones over years, shaping how you see the world and how you move through it. Most people don't question what looks official. They trust confidence. They trust authority. They trust what everyone else is doing. And in most cases this makes sense. We can't verify everything ourselves. We can't be experts in every field, skeptics of every claim, investigators of every statement. Society functions because we delegate trust to institutions, to credentials, to the collective judgment of those around us. But this efficiency comes with a cost. When we outsource our thinking too completely, we become vulnerable. Not to dramatic deceptions or obvious lies, but to the subtle errors that accumulate in systems where no one feels responsible for verification. The small mistakes that survive because everyone assumes someone else is checking. The flawed assumptions that get passed from generation to generation because questioning them feels unnecessary, even disrespectful. I've always been the opposite. Not because I wanted to stand out. Not because I enjoyed contradicting others or proving myself smarter. Certainly not because I had some natural gift for seeing what others missed. No, my tendency to question came from a different place entirely. It came from learning early in life that silence, observation, and patience were often safer than speaking too soon. I grew up watching the consequences of blind trust. I saw people accept information without verification and suffer for it later. I saw decisions made on faulty premises, relationships damaged by unexamined assumptions, opportunities lost because no one asked the obvious questions until it was too late. And I saw something else too, something that shaped me perhaps even more profoundly. I saw how quickly the crowd could turn on someone who questioned the wrong thing at the wrong time. Speaking up isn't always rewarded. Sometimes it's punished. Sometimes the person who points out the error becomes the target of resentment, not gratitude. Sometimes being right matters less than being agreeable, being quiet, being one of the group. So I learned to watch, to wait, to observe before acting. Not from cowardice but from strategy. From the recognition that timing matters as much as truth. That how you say something often determines whether it's heard at all. That the quietest voice in the room can sometimes have the most impact, but only if it speaks at the right moment, in the right way, with the right evidence. This isn't the lesson most people take from stories about speaking up. Usually the narrative is simpler. Be brave, challenge authority, don't be afraid to stand out. And there's truth in that. But it's incomplete. Because the student in that classroom didn't just speak up. They did something more difficult. They waited until they were sure enough. They chose words carefully. They framed their question as genuine inquiry rather than accusation. They made it easy for the professor to acknowledge the error without losing face. That's not just courage. That's skill. Social intelligence. The kind of nuanced communication that turns a potentially confrontational moment into a collaborative one. And that's what I took from that moment. Not just the importance of questioning but the art of doing it well. Over the years I've refined this approach. I've learned when to speak immediately and when to hold back. I've learned how to raise concerns in ways that invite dialogue rather than defensiveness. I've learned that the goal isn't to prove others wrong, but to get closer to the truth, and that this usually requires making the other person feel like a partner in discovery rather than an opponent in debate. This is harder than it sounds. Our instincts often push us toward extremes. We either stay silent when we should speak, or we speak harshly when we should be gentle. We either accept everything we're told, or we become contrarians who reject things simply because they're popular. Finding the middle ground, critical but constructive, skeptical but open, confident but humble, requires constant calibration. It requires paying attention not just to what's being said, but to who's saying it and why. Not just to the content of an argument, but to the context in which it exists. Not just to the logical validity of a claim, but to the social dynamics that determine whether it will be heard, understood, and acted upon. This is exhausting, honestly. It would be so much easier to simply trust or simply doubt, to follow the crowd or always oppose it. But that's not how truth works. That's not how the world works. The errors that matter most are rarely obvious. They're embedded in assumptions that feel natural, in processes that seem to work, in systems that appear stable until they suddenly aren't. Catching these errors requires a particular kind of attention. Persistent, patient, and unassuming. The kind of attention that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't demand recognition, that works quietly in the background while everyone else focuses on the surface. I've carried this lesson with me through every stage of my life. In school, where I learned that grades and understanding aren't always the same thing. In work, where I saw how often the loudest voices shape decisions regardless of their expertise. In relationships, where I discovered that the things left unsaid often matter more than the things spoken. And everywhere, in every domain, I found the same pattern. The small details others skip are usually the ones that matter most. Not because people are careless or stupid, but because attention is finite and the world is complex. We can't examine everything equally, so we develop shortcuts. We trust familiar patterns. We defer to authority. We assume that the important things have already been verified. Most of the time, these shortcuts serve us well. They allow us to function in a world with far more information than we could ever process consciously. But they also create blind spots. And those blind spots are where errors hide, where assumptions go unchallenged, where the foundations of our thinking develop cracks that only become visible much later. That moment in the classroom, the raised hand, the frozen chalk, the quiet correction, represents everything I've come to value about careful thinking. Not certainty but curiosity. Not confrontation but clarification. Not the satisfaction of proving someone wrong, but the shared benefit of getting something right. This is what that moment taught me. And it's what I try to practice every day in ways large and small. The world doesn't need more people who are always certain. It needs more people who are willing to pause, to look closer, to ask the questions that everyone else assumes have already been answered. Because they usually haven't. Growing up, I watched people with real ability go unnoticed. Not because they weren't capable, Not because they lacked intelligence or creativity or dedication. Their skills were genuine, their contributions valuable, their potential evident to anyone who took the time to look closely. But the world doesn't always take the time to look closely. The world rewards performance. It rewards visibility. It rewards the appearance of competence as much as competence itself, sometimes more. And so I watched talented people fade into the background, their abilities overlooked not because they were insufficient, but because they weren't packaged in the expected way. I watched brilliant minds stay silent in meetings while less capable but more confident voices dominated the discussion. I watched innovative ideas die quiet deaths because they were offered tentatively, without the forceful certainty that commands attention. I watched careers stall and opportunities pass to others who were better at marketing themselves but worse at actually delivering results. This pattern repeated everywhere I looked. In classrooms, where students who thought deeply but spoke hesitantly were overlooked in favor of those who raised their hands quickly, even when their answers were shallow. In workplaces, where promotions went to those who claimed credit loudly rather than those who produced value quietly. In social settings, where the most interesting people often stood at the edges of rooms, their insights never shared because they weren't comfortable interrupting the louder conversations at the center. And I noticed something else too, something that made the pattern even more painful to observe. The quiet ones usually knew they were being overlooked. They saw the less qualified person get the promotion. They heard their own ideas repeated by others who received credit for them. They understood, sometimes with crushing clarity, that the game was rigged against people who couldn't or wouldn't play by its performative rules. But they didn't change. They couldn't or they wouldn't. Not because they lacked self-awareness, but because the kind of self-promotion the world seemed to require felt fundamentally inauthentic to them. It felt like lying even when it wasn't. It felt like becoming someone they didn't want to be. So they stayed quiet. They did good work and hoped it would speak for itself. And sometimes it did, but often it didn't. I saw this happen to mentors, to friends, to family members, to people I admired deeply for their knowledge, their integrity, their genuine expertise. And I saw it happen to myself. In school, I was often the student who knew the answer but didn't raise my hand. Not because I was uncertain, but because speaking up felt presumptuous. Because I had learned that being visibly smart could attract the wrong kind of attention. Resentment from peers, unrealistic expectations from teachers, the exhausting pressure of always having to perform. So I observed. I listened. I contributed when directly asked but rarely volunteered. And I watched as students who contributed less but spoke more received the recognition that never seemed to find its way to me. This wasn't bitterness exactly. It was education. I was learning how the world actually worked as opposed to how it was supposed to work. I was learning that merit and recognition are related but not identical, that visibility often matters more than substance, that the stories people believe about who has value are shaped by factors that have little to do with actual value. I was learning that the quiet ones need different strategies. Not strategies for becoming loud, that was neither possible nor desirable for most of us. But strategies for being heard despite the quietness. Strategies for ensuring that our contributions were visible even when we ourselves preferred to remain in the background. Strategies for playing the game well enough to achieve our goals without sacrificing the authenticity that made the game feel uncomfortable in the first place. These weren't lessons taught in any classroom. No one explicitly explained that being smart wasn't enough, that working hard wasn't enough, that even being right wasn't always enough. These were lessons learned through painful observation, through watching and waiting and slowly understanding that the rules of success were different from what we had been told. And there was another lesson hidden within these experiences, perhaps the most important one of all. Being quiet didn't mean being wrong. The assumptions the world made about quiet people were frequently false. Silence wasn't emptiness. Hesitation wasn't ignorance. Taking time to think before speaking wasn't a sign of slow thinking but often a sign of more thorough thinking. The quiet people I knew often saw things others missed. Not because they were smarter in some general sense, but because they spent more time observing and less time performing. Because they weren't using their mental energy on crafting impressive-sounding responses, they had more available for actually understanding what was happening. This is one of the great ironies of how the world evaluates people. The traits that make someone good at being noticed are often inversely related to the traits that make someone good at understanding. The person who talks the most in a meeting often listens the least. The person who projects the most confidence often has examined their own assumptions the least. The person who seems most certain is often the one with the most unexamined blind spots. And conversely, the person who speaks hesitantly may be doing so because they're aware of complexities others haven't considered. The person who qualifies their statements with uncertainty may be demonstrating precision rather than weakness. The person who takes time before responding may be thinking more carefully, not less. But these signals are easy to misread. In a world that rewards quick, confident responses, thoughtful hesitation looks like inadequacy. In a world that values visibility, operating behind the scenes looks like hiding. In a world that confuses loudness with importance, quietness looks like absence. I lived in this misunderstanding for years. Watching others misjudge the quiet people around me. Watching others misjudge me. Learning to navigate a world that wasn't designed for the way my mind worked. And slowly, gradually, I found my way. Not by becoming louder, but by becoming more strategic. By learning when quietness was an asset and when it was a liability. By developing the skills to be visible when it mattered while preserving the observational advantages of staying in the background. I learned that you can be heard without shouting. That you can make an impact without seeking attention. That the small, carefully placed intervention often achieves more than the grand, dramatic gesture. I learned that the quiet years weren't wasted. They were preparation. Preparation for understanding how people really think and act, rather than how they claim to. Preparation for developing the patience and persistence that meaningful work requires. Preparation for becoming someone who could see what others missed. Not because of special talent, but because of countless hours spent watching, listening, and learning. The world doesn't often celebrate the quiet ones. But perhaps that's fitting. Because we're not in it for the celebration. We're in it for the understanding. And that, ultimately, is its own reward. Over time, I started paying attention to details others skipped. Not dramatic details. Not the obvious errors or glaring contradictions that anyone would notice. Those are easy. Those practically announce themselves. No, I became interested in something subtler. The small assumptions, the unquestioned steps. The parts of a story everyone rushes past on their way to the conclusion. This happened gradually. It wasn't a conscious decision to become some kind of detail-oriented investigator. It was more like developing a taste or a sensitivity. Once I started noticing these things, I couldn't stop noticing them. They jumped out at me even when I wasn't looking. A statistic cited without a source. A logical step that seemed to skip over important considerations. A claim that sounded reasonable but relied on premises that were never examined. The space between what someone said and what they actually meant. These small things fascinated me because they were where the interesting stuff happened. The big claims were usually carefully polished. They were the parts people prepared for, the parts they expected to be questioned. But the small details? The underlying assumptions? The quick transitions from one point to another? Those were unguarded. Those revealed the actual thinking, or the lack of it. I learned to ask different kinds of questions. Not, is this conclusion correct? But, how did they get there? Not, do I agree with this claim? But, what would have to be true for this claim to hold? Not, what is this person saying? But, what are they not saying and why? These questions led me to a different kind of understanding. Less about memorizing information and more about evaluating it. Less about accepting arguments and more about testing their foundations. And I discovered something surprising. Most foundations are weaker than they appear. Not because people are dishonest, though some are, but because thorough verification is hard. It takes time. It requires questioning things that feel settled. Most of us don't have the energy or incentive to do it for every claim we encounter. So we build elaborate structures on foundations we've never actually examined. We construct entire belief systems on premises we accepted without thought. We make decisions that affect our lives based on assumptions that might crumble if we ever looked at them closely. I'm not saying this is wrong exactly. It's necessary. We can't verify everything. We have to trust something. But it does create vulnerability. And it means that anyone willing to look more carefully than others can see things that remain invisible to everyone else. This wasn't about superiority or proving others wrong. Let me be clear about that because it's easy to misunderstand. Paying attention to small things wasn't a way of feeling better than other people. It wasn't about catching mistakes so I could embarrass someone or claim intellectual dominance. That kind of motivation would have made me worse at this, not better, because it would have colored my observation with ego and made me see what I wanted to see rather than what was actually there. No, this was about something else entirely. It was about truth. About getting closer to how things actually worked rather than how they appeared to work. About building my own understanding on solid foundations rather than inherited assumptions. And it was about protection. Because the small details others skip are often the ones that come back to cause problems. The contract clause no one reads carefully. The warning sign everyone dismisses. The early indicator that something is wrong, visible only to those paying the right kind of attention. I've watched this pattern play out countless times. A project that failed because of an assumption made in the first week that no one revisited. A relationship that deteriorated because of a small misunderstanding that was never addressed. A business decision that seemed sound until the overlooked detail became the fatal flaw. The people who suffer these failures aren't stupid. They're often brilliant. But their brilliance was focused on the wrong things, on the big picture, on the visible components, on the parts that seemed important at the time. The small things slipped through. This is why I pay attention to them now. Not because I'm naturally gifted at noticing details, but because I've learned, through observation and experience, how much they matter. And I've learned something else too. Slowing down is itself a rare skill. In a world that rewards speed, pausing to examine something carefully feels almost subversive. There's pressure to respond quickly, to form opinions immediately, to move on to the next thing before you've fully understood the current thing. But most mistakes aren't made by people who were too slow. They're made by people who were too fast, who committed to answers before they'd fully understood the questions, who moved forward before they'd verified the ground beneath them. The willingness to slow down, to look closer, to resist the pressure for immediate response. This is increasingly valuable precisely because it's increasingly rare. I don't claim to be perfect at this. I still miss things. I still make assumptions I shouldn't. I still rush past details that matter. But I've developed habits that help. Practices that increase the odds of catching what others miss. When someone presents an argument, I trace it backward. What assumptions does this require? What would have to be true for this to work? Are those things actually true or just assumed? When I read something that seems obviously correct, I pause. Why does it seem obvious? Is it because it's actually well supported, or because it matches what I already believe? Would I find it equally convincing if it pointed to a different conclusion? When everyone agrees on something, I get curious. Unanimous agreement is sometimes a sign of truth, but it's also sometimes a sign that no one is thinking independently, that everyone is following everyone else in a circle of unexamined consensus. These habits don't make me popular necessarily. They slow things down. They ask questions that others consider settled. They introduce friction into processes that were running smoothly, or at least appeared to be. But they also catch things. They reveal errors before those errors compound. They identify weaknesses before those weaknesses become failures. And occasionally they uncover something genuinely important. A hidden assumption that changes everything once it's exposed. A small mistake that was quietly distorting an entire line of reasoning. A different perspective that opens up possibilities no one had considered. That's why I pay attention to small things. Not because I want to be right, but because I want to understand. And understanding, real understanding, lives in the details. This channel exists for people who think quietly. For people who have sat in rooms full of confident voices and felt like outsiders because they preferred to listen before speaking. For people who have been told they're too reserved, too analytical, too slow to respond, when really they were just being thorough. For people who have been underestimated. Not because they lacked ability, but because they lacked the kind of aggressive self-presentation that the world often mistakes for competence. Because their contributions were delivered quietly rather than announced loudly. Because they preferred being right to appearing right, even when that preference cost them recognition, opportunities, advancement. This channel is for those people. It's for people who noticed something important, but hesitated to speak. Who saw an error others missed, but doubted themselves because no one else seemed concerned. Who had an insight that could have mattered, but let the moment pass because speaking up felt presumptuous or risky or just too uncomfortable. I know that hesitation intimately. I've lived it countless times. And I've watched others live it too. Brilliant people, thoughtful people, people with genuine contributions to make, falling silent when they should have spoken. This channel exists because those moments deserve recognition. Not as failures to learn from, but as experiences to understand. Not as embarrassments to move past, but as glimpses into a different way of moving through the world. A quieter way, a more observational way, a way that has its own strengths even when those strengths aren't always visible. The stories here aren't about revenge or humiliation. Let me be very clear about that because there are plenty of spaces online that cater to those impulses. Spaces where underestimated person proves everyone wrong is really just a vehicle for schadenfreude, for the vicarious pleasure of watching others fail. That's not what this is. The stories here are about recognition. Recognition of what happens when assumptions fail. Not as a moment of triumph for the person who was underestimated, but as a moment of learning for everyone involved. About the cost of overlooking careful thinking. The real cost, which usually isn't dramatic or visible but accumulates slowly, in decisions that could have been better, in errors that could have been avoided, in potential that was never realized because no one was paying attention to the right things. and about the power of noticing what others miss. Not as a superpower or a special gift, but as a practice, a choice, a habit that can be developed by anyone willing to slow down, look closer, and question what everyone else accepts without thought. These stories matter because they show something that doesn't get shown often enough. The world is full of narratives about bold action and confident leadership. About people who succeeded because they believed in themselves loudly enough, asserted themselves forcefully enough, demanded recognition insistently enough. And those narratives aren't wrong exactly. They capture something real about how success often works. But they're incomplete. They miss the other kind of success, the quieter kind. The success that comes from seeing clearly rather than speaking loudly. From understanding deeply rather than responding quickly. From being patient enough to wait for the right moment rather than forcing every moment to be the right one. This kind of success doesn't make for dramatic stories usually. It happens in small moments that most people don't notice. A correction offered carefully at the right time. An error caught before it could compound. A decision improved by a perspective that almost wasn't shared. But these small moments add up. They shape outcomes. They matter even when they're not celebrated. And the people who create these moments, the quiet observers, the careful thinkers, the ones who hesitate not from weakness but from thoroughness, deserve to see themselves reflected somewhere. That's what this channel is for. It's a space for those stories. For the moments when careful attention made a difference. For the recognition that the world's standard metrics often fail to provide. It's a space where being quiet isn't a weakness to overcome, but a different kind of strength to understand and develop. It's a reminder that the person who pauses to think isn't necessarily slower than the person who responds immediately. They might actually be faster to the truth, just slower to the performance. Sometimes all it takes is one small correction to change the entire room. That was the lesson from the classroom. The raised hand, the frozen chalk, the moment of collective recalibration when everyone realized that what they had accepted without question was actually worth questioning. That moment happened because someone was willing to pause when everyone else was moving forward. Because someone trusted their own observation even when it contradicted the apparent consensus. Because someone spoke up carefully, not to embarrass or to prove a point, but simply to get things right. These moments happen more often than we realize. Mostly in small ways that never become stories. Someone catches an error in a report. Someone asks a clarifying question that reveals a hidden assumption. Someone stays quiet long enough to notice what everyone else missed. These are the moments that actually shape outcomes, even when they don't generate recognition. These are the moments that separate real understanding from the appearance of understanding. And these are the moments this channel exists to illuminate. Not to celebrate the underestimated at the expense of everyone else. Not to indulge in righteous vindication or elaborate revenge fantasies. Not to pretend that the quiet ones are always right while the loud ones are always wrong. But to recognize that there's more than one way to contribute. More than one kind of intelligence. More than one path to genuine understanding. And to remind everyone, especially those who have felt overlooked or undervalued, that the world needs people who think quietly. Who observe carefully. Who speak up not for the attention but for the truth. That's why these stories matter. And that's why I'm here. To find them. To share them. To create a space where they can be heard. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just clearly. Because sometimes that's all it takes.